We are very happy that Professor Grover Furr was able to contribute to today's meeting. It's a very important meeting because we are actually fighting US imperialism. We are fighting the Trotskyism, and we are fighting modern revisionism through this meeting. And so it's a very important meeting. You see, if you look in the history of Soviet Union and imperialism, throughout the Cold War, the bourgeoisie and the Trotskyists carried out attacks on Stalin. The United States spent millions of dollars to fight communism. They were not taken seriously in the 1930s, the 1940s, until the 20th Congress. And the 20th Congress, in that, Khrushchev came out with a speech which is now very well known. There's no point in going into it. But what we did not know is that Khrushchev had been a member of the Trotskyist opposition in 1923 and 1924. Yes, many people pointed out in 1956 onwards that the speech of Khrushchev was in the Trotskyist tradition, but nobody knew that Khrushchev had been in the 1920s a supporter of Trotsky. And this only came to be known in the 1990s when a book came out of the memoirs of Kaganovich. So if we go into Kaganovich's book, we will find the truth about Khrushchev and Trotsky. It was Khrushchev who validated the lies of Trotsky of 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. So it's a very important thing to know. Khrushchev returned to his Trotskyist roots after the death of Stalin. It led to the destruction of the communist parties. And even when the speech was made by Khrushchev attacking Stalin, all the members, all the leaders of the democratic camp supported Khrushchev. That is also a very important thing. No leader of the democratic camp came out in favor of Stalin in February 1926. If you look at the speeches, all supported. Some people even said that Stalin sabotaged our revolution. He did not want it. I will not mention names. So, defense of Stalin was confined to very few people. And by Professor Grover Furr, in his remarkable book, Khrushchev Lied, attacked the core of modern revisionism, Trotskyism, and the CIA lies. That is the significance of the book. That is the significance of Professor Grover Furr. Even now, when people defend Stalin, if you refer to Professor Grover Furr and you refer to the book Khrushchev Lies, you will be showered with abuse. Now, just last week, I was having a dialogue with a eminent journalist from Kolkata. So I mentioned that you read Khrushchev Light, and then the man who normally is journalist who normally attacks communism printed a number circulated a number of documents attacking Grover Furr. Just as the Hindutva forces have been attacking the left and the secular forces, of course, many pages have been written against Grover Furr. That he's not a historian, he's not a specialist. The bourgeois scholars do not take him seriously. Naturally, the bourgeois scholars don't take him seriously. And this was circulated last week. When Khrushchev Lied was published, in English, people telephoned the publisher and said, "What have you done?" They were Trotskyists from Kolkata. They said, "What have you done? Your reputation will fall." They were from America, from United Kingdom. Trotskyists contacted the publisher. "What have you done? You will be ruined." So this is the reaction to the work of Grover Furr. Now, it was very difficult, even in America, to get Khrushchev Lied translated. And we offered that in India we can try to publish it. And even then it took 2 years to arrange for the publication of Khrushchev Lied. Now, fortunately now it has been translated into half a dozen Indian languages. I believe it has been translated into Telugu and Tamil and Bengali and Hindi. So we hope that more languages it will be translated. So Grover Furr has done a commendable job in interpreting the new archival material which has come out of ex-Soviet Union. And one prominent book which came out in 2003 in Moscow was the book Inoue Stalin, the other Stalin, the different Stalin. It was written by a historian by the name of Yuri Zhukov. Now, Yuri Zhukov, who came out with this book, was not a Marxist. He was a Russian patriot who wanted to know the truth, and he was a historian. Let me tell you that if you look at the publications in Russia in the 1990s and early 2000s, years of 2000, there was a massive drive to publish bourgeois and Trotskyist literature in Russian. And they were very successful. Under Gorbachev, lakhs of books were published, in lakhs of copies, books were published by Bukharin, Trotsky, Rykov, all the anti-Soviet writers of the Stalin period. And in the 1990s, after Gorbachev, the bourgeois literature was published. But what is interesting is that after 10 years of bourgeois literature, there was a tremendous reaction. And from 2005 or so, there have been hundreds of books published in Russian, which are defending Stalin. So the bourgeois and revisionist attacks led to the Stalin defense. And what Grover Furr has done in his book on democratic reform in Stalin is to bring to the English speaking world the material published by Yuri Zhukov in Moscow. And Yuri Zhukov said very correctly that from the 1950s, in the 1940s, and in the 19th Congress of the CPSU in 1952, Stalin and his circle made serious attempts to democratize the party and the state and to bring about the education of the cadre which has come out of the revolution. Now we know that communism is a higher form of democracy, and the bourgeoisie and the imperialists attack communism for being inferior to democracy. But as Stalin said, what is the point of having such bourgeois norms when you don't have food in your stomach? So what did Stalin want? He wanted that there be several candidates in the primary elections in which non-party people would be in competition with party people. Even the party candidates who were selected in the 1930s, it is very interesting that the party candidates came in front of their constituents and in front of the trade unions of that era, and they were grilled. They were grilled by the people. What have you done and what are you going to do? There are accounts of this book in publications which came out in the 1930s. There's a book by Pat Sloan on Soviet democracy, which is an excellent book, and it should also be published in Malayali. And there is also some Americans who visited the Soviet Union. And one of these guys worked in the Lenin Library, and he gives a description of how the candidates were grilled. So it was a question of moving from one form of democracy to another form of democracy. And this is the essential point which is made by Yuri Zhukov, that those people who had come up in the revolution and in the civil war, they were worried that if they were sent off for education and they were removed from their post temporarily, and if they had competition with non-party people, they may not be elected. And Yuri Zhukov gives a full account of how the first secretaries in the Soviet Union fought back against Stalin's proposals and the proposals of the people around Stalin, like Molotov and Kaganovich. The only way that these people could counter Stalin was to argue that there are many attempts to revolt against the regime from the ex-kulaks, the ex-bureaucrats, the ex-bourgeoisie. And this led to sections of Soviet intelligence and the parties to persecute sections of the party which they felt was a threat. But what Yuri Zhukov says is that the decisive factor which persuaded Stalin and his circle to stop this democratization was the fact that a number of genuine conspiracies to remove Soviet power, to end the leadership of the Soviet Party, and particularly the Tukhachevsky conspiracy, about which Grover Furr wrote one of his early articles in 1998. This stopped democratization in the 30s, and even in 1952, there was a problem in that democratization which Stalin advocated could not take place, partly because Stalin died at a particular point. And of course, Stalin's death has always been a kind of mystery at best. 2 points I would like to make before I complete my discussion. This article by Grover Furr was published in 2005, and in that he says that there was mention of the program of the Communist Party, which was drafted in 1947, and that was not available. Actually, even when Grover Furr talks about that program, it was there in the archives. In fact, I got it out of the Moscow archives, and I have a copy of it in Russian. And subsequently, in recent years, in last 2 years, a full book has come out on the 1947 Communist Party draft by a leading member of the journal Pravda. And secondly, this book has come out in 3-4 years back, and it is a huge volume. You can see it's a very fat volume of economic discussions between 1947 and 1953. And part of that is the 1947 discussion and the documents around the 1947 program. So that remains to be studied. I wanted to point it out because we need to update what was written in 2005. Second point I'd like to make is that it is not very clear, as Professor Grover argues, that there are continuities in the views of Stalin and Beria. I have read very carefully what Grover has written in this book and elsewhere on Beria, but I believe that these his views are quite controversial, and views in the communist movement are divided. Even when Beria died, or when Stalin died, Beria, Malenkov, and Khrushchev went to see Stalin when he was lying on the floor in his dacha. He was unconscious. No medical attention was given by these three people to bring a doctor to give medication to Stalin. That's very important. After, in Beria's 100 days of power, many criminals were released from jail, caused a number of problems. Beria had interesting points on Germany, and his views were quite unproblematical, but he wanted to have a relationship with the Yugoslavia, which was very controversial. Not that better relations should not have been there with Yugoslavia, but Beria contacted Yugoslav intelligence without going through the party. And there's a letter to that effect, which has been published in English also, in which this is discussed. So I would like to end there, and I'd like to end by congratulating the comrades in Kerala for having published this book and of having an open international discussion on this book. I hope that their good work will continue, and I also must thank you for inviting me to say a few words in this meeting. Thank you very much.